Hello and welcome, fellow bookworms and film fans. Welcome to this week's episode of The Contented Narrative. I'll be looking at The Exorcist by Peter Blatty. Now, it was written in 1971 and then it was adapted to screen in 1977. Now, I will be, as usual, looking at the three things. So I'll be looking at how good is the book, how good is the film, and how well does the film take from the book. So the film, I'd never actually watched it until I got with Michael, as is the case of a lot of the films that I watch. But it is like your typical kind of horror film. It has that little bit of a build up at the start, and then when things kick off, they kick off big. And it's thoroughly, it's so enjoyable, and it basically follows this little girl, Reagan, who has been possessed. But at first they don't think she's possessed, and the mum is basically going out of her mind with worry, takes her to all these different specialists, and these specialists are like, no, it's just this, oh it's this, oh it's this, oh it's this. And obviously nothing works. No medication works, nothing at all. And she's going out of her mind, and then she kind of starts toying with the idea that she might be possessed, and that it might be worth having an exorcism of her daughter. So this then escalates. She then gets a priest involved, and the priest gets her lovely older priest involved as well, and it all ends in bloodshed and tears. It has been out for a while, so if you haven't seen it or you don't know how it ends, then I won't spoil it for you in this section, but I will later. I would definitely say give it a watch. It is very good. It's very atmospheric. There's a certain scene with like a priest underneath a lamppost with like the fog rolling in, and it's a very, very well directed film, shall we say. It's very well acclaimed. I quite enjoyed it. I probably wouldn't. It's not one that I would rewatch quite regularly, but if like Michael suggests let's give it a watch, then I'll give it a watch. So it'll probably get about a 7 out of 10 from me, because as I said, it's not one that I would necessarily go, oh, do you know what I fancy watching? So, but it is a very good film. So the book. Now, I bought this book for Michael for Christmas because I kind of wanted to do it on the channel as a book to film adaptation. So I've then obviously given it a read, and there's a lot more in the book. It's, as I said, I'll discuss the plot in its entirety a little bit later, but at the moment obviously I won't. It still follows the same characters. So you've still got Reagan, who gets possessed, you've still got the mum, you've still got the priest, you've got the household, you've got the build up, you've got all of that, but it's a lot more, and in some of the phrasing and the wordings is a lot more evocative than maybe they could have put across on screen, as well as when the exorcism actually comes around. Obviously it is quite a big bit in the film. In the book it is very well described, so I will admit that bit did bore me a little. Now it sounds really bad, and I hope you guys don't come for me with your pitchforks, but I genuinely at points felt like I wanted to just skip ahead, because I was like, I get it, you're saying all these Latin phrases from the Bible, you're trying to expel the spirit, fine, can we just move on? And I find it probably translates better when you watch it as opposed to when you read it. So I read it every page, but I must admit I did reach a point where I was like trying to rush through it because I wanted to get it done, rather than I wanted to rush through it because I was enjoying it. So although it was a well-written book and it was a good story, I probably wouldn't reread it, but it still gets about 7 out of 10 from me, because it was a good story, and I did quite like the characters, and I did feel sorry for the mum, and she tried everything for her daughter, and everything that ends in bloodshed and tears, I did feel sorry for them as well. And the build-up was really good, and the little drops in here and there were really, really good. I just felt like some points were just a lot longer than I was expecting, and it just kind of got to me a little bit, but that's just me. If you agree or disagree with anything, you can always, as usual, put it below in the comments. So we'll get to the plot now. Spoilers ahead, so if you haven't watched the film, if you haven't read the book and you want to do either, don't watch the rest of this episode, go away and watch or read it. So to be fair, it was quite similar in both plot and film, in the book and the film. So both of them start with a priest in the Middle East. Didn't realise that was Dr. Zeus. Starts with a priest in the Middle East, who comes across an amulet of Pazuzu, who is obviously a demon, and he starts feeling a bit of dread, and he feels like his end is nigh, as it were. So he heads back to the States. And then it jumps back into the States with Chris, who's the mum, daughter Reagan, and Chris is an actress in a film at the time that's kind of wrapping it up, and she's just doing some external shots and things like that. So in both, there are little things that are not quite right at the beginning. So obviously, you always get that in horror films. So, you know, like the knocking, the like, oh yeah, this is my imaginary friend who's not imaginary, who I can describe in great detail, who's like a 40-year-old woman, or, you know, little bits that maybe you should be paying more attention to. But things like a dress being moved, just the drawers being moved that Regan obviously can't move. So I don't know why they thought it was her messing around. And then sounds like rats in the attic, like little tippy tapping, but there's no rats anywhere. And when they put the rat traps down, nothing gets picked up. So it's kind of like you sat there going, huh, maybe. And now, but obviously logically, if you moved into a house and this kind of started happening, especially with your daughter as well, would you jump to demon possession? No. So in both, we're introduced very briefly to Captain Howdy, who is chatting with Regan via a Ouija board, because obviously I think she's like 10 or something, 10-year-old loves playing with Ouija boards. And she's got a best friend called Captain Howdy, who starts off being her friend and then ends up being really mean to her, and is the reason that she ends up getting possessed, essentially. So in both, we're also introduced to Father Karras, and he is having a crisis of faith because he's just trying to understand, you know, what the church actually means. Is he in the right profession? Like, he's left his mum behind. Should he go back to his mum and things like that? So he's having a bit of a crisis himself, because you've always got to have the clergy having a bit of a crisis in horror films. But in both now, it's amping up a bit. So Regan's acting worse. She's acting out. She's, you know, shouting back. She's not eating properly. She's, you know, there's this foul odour coming from her. The bed starts shaking. Furniture's moving a lot more. And so in both, Chris takes Regan to a doctor to find out what is happening. Now, she does this earlier in the book, and then she does it again later in the book. In the film, it's only kind of the once. And in both, we hear about the desecration of a church, well, several churches, but this one, and the Virgin Mary and all of that. And I feel like Father Karras's kind of order believe it might be him, because his mum has passed away and he's still having a bit of a crisis, and so they think for some unknown reason, of course, jump to Father Karras being the desecrator of the church. I think we figure out it might be Regan, or something like that, but that's here nor there. So in both as well, so as I said, this is very, very similar. So in both, while Chris is hosting a dinner party, Regan comes in, vacant expression, almost like she's sleepwalking. Try to say that a little bit quicker. And then just pees on the carpet. So obviously Chris is embarrassed, gets Regan back up to bed. The dinner party breaks up quite quickly. Now in the book, she gets given, like, this medium starts being like, oh, I think your daughter's, you know, going through something. She might be, well, she doesn't say possessed, but she goes, I'll drop by later, I'll help out, but I'm going away for a long time now. So it starts putting these thoughts into Chris's head that it could be something other than just a child acting out. But in both, Chris has all these tests on Regan and everything comes back negative. They've got no reason of what it could be. They keep putting her on different medications. They keep trying all these different things. In the book as well, at one point, Mum takes her away to this whole rehab facility, which doesn't work. But that's a little bit later. But yeah, so in both, there's a confrontation between Regan and some doctors at home, as she seems to be moving in unnatural ways. That scene did creep me out when I watched it. I don't like kids in horror films anyway. They really creep me out. I'm not a fan of them. But when she starts like crawling backwards on all fours, I can't watch that scene. No, I'm okay, thank you. But yeah, so they start going, oh, maybe, you know, you should be looking elsewhere, blah, 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 blah. Now, in the book, we get a lot more background with Chris and Dennings, who's the director of the film, and we get, you know, a lot more of like the staff's working conditions as well. And as I said, it's a lot of filler stuff that you wouldn't necessarily need in the film. So in the film and the book, however, Dennings comes round and it's just kind of Regan in the house, and then he's found dead at the bottom of like this really long set of stairs with his neck broken. So everybody's kind of like, oh, it's tragic, he fell, he was a drunk, blah, blah, blah. And there's this one copper that's like, someone in that house killed him, because they snapped his neck, basically turned his head full round before they even threw him down the stairs. But yeah, so you get that detective start picking and then realising that actually Reagan's the only one that could have been in the house, but there's no way. And then he's like, could there be a way? But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is now in the book after the death of Dennings, when she checks her into this rehab facility, goes away with her to just try and cure her, which obviously it doesn't work. And so now in both, Reagan is tied to the bed fully. Chris is starting to lose hope. And she starts reading up on exorcisms, and she starts reaching out and putting little feelers out, being like, could it possibly be? And so on and so forth. So now she's reached out and she's got Father Karras involved. And upon meeting Reagan, at first Father Karras would like to believe that she's possessed, and then is like, actually no, I don't think she is. You've been reading this, you've been putting these thoughts into her head, she's probably just picking up on this, she's probably aware of this. And so he's very nonchalant about it and like, oh, it's just maybe a psychiatric thing. And obviously Chris is losing her mind because she's like, I've tried everything, just somebody listen to me. You really do feel for her. She goes through the ringer. But then he starts meeting with her a few more times, and again, this is in the book and in the film. So he starts meeting with her a few more times, and then he starts listening to different tapes from before she was possessed and now when she's possessed, and he starts chatting to her a bit more, and then he starts going away and thinking, actually, she could be. So he goes away and he tries to convince his order to let him perform an exorcism, because apparently it's something that you need permission for, which I can understand, because, you know, apparently 99% of the time people die. Who knew? So in both, Chris admits to Father Karras that Reagan was the one that killed Dennings. Dennings didn't trip and fall out. So this is when as well Karras goes, well, okay, so clearly something's not right, because she's a 10-year-old and she's just thrown this man clean out the window with his neck and his head twisted round. So meanwhile, in both, Kinderman, the cop, still thinks Dennings was murdered, but can't quite pin it on anybody, can't quite figure it out. And he's starting to get to the idea that actually everyone was where they were supposed to be, even though someone's alibi didn't check out. When he went and found out what it actually was, he then went, oh, actually, no, that does make sense. So he's actually starting to get to the point where he knows that Reagan's the only one in, and he can't figure out how she did it. So in both, we've got the arrival of Father Merrin under the lamppost. You know, very iconic shot, brilliantly shot, and I love it. I really do. So Father Merrin arrives to help Father Karras with the exorcism, which goes on a long time. So the exorcism has a lot of swearing in it, a lot of home truths were happening in there, and then the demon kills Father Merrin. Merrin kind of knew his life was ending, which is why he got this doom and gloom when he saw Pazuzu in the Middle East. But then Father Karras takes the demon into himself and jumps out the window to kill it, saving Reagan. So in this as well, Kinderman, before, you know, this whole death of events, figures out what's happened and goes to Father Karras and goes, what's going on? And Father Karras tells him the truth. So Kinderman's kind of like, okay, I'll rule it as an accident. But yeah, so Father Merrin's now dead, Father Karras is now dead, and Reagan is now free. So Reagan is now cured, back to normal, happy little 10-year-old girl, as if nothing ever happened. And both the book and the film end with Reagan and Chris moving to LA, packing up their house. You've got Dyer, who was the priest that knew Father Karras, and Detective Kinderman, not quite getting all the answers of what actually happened that night when two priests were dead, but kind of understanding the situation and not really wanting to push it. And you get a really sweet moment with Reagan kissing Dyer's cheek, and just basically giving him a little bit of hope. So the film was incredibly close to the book. As I said, there was a lot of like filler from the book that you wouldn't necessarily have in the film. Otherwise, it'd be a ridiculously long film, which most films now are like topping over 3 hours. But I think it might help that the author actually wrote the screenplay. So a lot of the stuff in the film as well was kind of lifted verbatim from the book. Certain scenes as well, verbatim from the book. So it really helped to have that in place. But I mean, due to the fact that it was more the background, the multiple trips to doctors, the multiple trips to see, you know, to see Reagan, all of the kind of filler little bits, I'd say it was really, really good. It's very close to the source material, and it gets a 9 out of 10 from me. Now, obviously, if you agree or disagree with anything that I've said, please leave it below in the comments. If you're enjoying my books recommendations, please leave it below in the comments. I'd love to know if a book that I've recommended, you know, 5 stars or whatever, you really enjoy. So please let me know. But alternatively, if I've recommended a book and it's one that I wasn't particularly fond of, I'd love to know if you thought differently. So thank you very much for your continued support, and remember to always keep it contento.